Some promises are buried so deeply that only a faithful heart remembers where they belong. The moving truck disappears down the narrow county road, leaving behind nothing but drifting dust and the quiet hum of late afternoon wind moving through endless rows of oak trees. Daniel Carter stands alone beside his modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Ash Hollow, Missouri, a small American town where everyone seems to know every face except his. At 45 years old, the white American veteran has long since traded Marine uniforms for faded flannel shirts, sturdy denim jeans, and weathered leather boots. Yet something in the way he carries himself still reflects years of discipline that never completely fade. Beside him waits Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat glowing beneath the autumn sunlight and intelligent amber eyes that never wander far from his owner. The farmhouse is older than Daniel expected. White paint peels gently from the wooden porch. A rusty windmill creaks somewhere behind the weathered barn. Golden leaves drift lazily across the yard while the scent of fresh earth, cedar, and distant wood smoke settles into the cool October air. It is exactly the kind of peaceful place Daniel hoped might finally quiet the memories he has carried since leaving military service. He exhales slowly, looking across the wide pasture stretching behind the property until his attention settles on a magnificent old oak tree standing alone near the crest of a gentle hill. The tree is enormous, its thick trunk scarred by countless seasons, its sprawling branches reaching toward the pale blue sky, like weathered hands protecting the land beneath them. Shadow notices it at exactly the same moment. The German shepherd suddenly lifts his head. His ears stand perfectly upright. His breathing changes almost imperceptibly. Daniel smiles faintly. "Go ahead," he says softly. "Stretch your legs." Shadow takes off across the grass with effortless grace, bounding through scattered leaves while Daniel begins unloading boxes from the truck. He carries only 2 inside before realizing something unusual. The familiar sound of paws running has stopped. Curious, he turns toward the hill. Shadow has reached the old oak tree, but instead of exploring the surrounding fields or chasing squirrels through the fallen leaves, the shepherd stands completely still beside the massive trunk. Several quiet seconds pass. Then Shadow begins digging. Not wildly, not frantically. His powerful front paws move with calm determination, pushing aside loose soil one careful scoop at a time while his nose remains close to the ground. Daniel walks toward him, amused more than concerned. "What did you find over there, partner?" he asks with a gentle laugh. Shadow never looks away from the earth beneath the tree. He continues digging for another few moments before stopping, lowering his nose into the shallow hole, then quietly sitting beside it as though waiting for something Daniel cannot see. Daniel kneels beside him and brushes away the loose dirt with one hand. Beneath the fresh soil lies nothing except old roots, smooth stones, and decades of fallen leaves that have slowly become part of the earth. He smiles and scratches behind Shadow's ears. "Guess it was nothing after all." Shadow looks directly into Daniel's eyes for a long moment. There is no excitement, no confusion, only quiet certainty. Daniel gently fills the small hole with his boot and stands. Together they return toward the farmhouse as the afternoon sun settles lower behind the distant hills. Yet halfway back, Daniel notices Shadow stop once more. The German shepherd turns his head toward the ancient oak tree one final time before following without resistance. That evening, as golden light fades into the first quiet stars above Ash Hollow, Daniel glances through the kitchen window while unpacking another box. Far beyond the pasture, the silhouette of the old oak stands alone against the darkening sky. Beside it, barely visible beneath the fading light, Shadow sits silently facing the tree again, as though listening for a voice carried only by the wind. The first morning in Ash Hollow begins with the soft sound of wind moving through dry autumn grass and the faint call of mourning doves somewhere beyond the rolling fields. A pale layer of mist floats just above the ground while the rising sun slowly paints the old farmhouse in warm shades of gold. Daniel Carter steps onto the weathered porch carrying a steaming enamel mug of black coffee, breathing deeply as the scent of damp earth, cedar, and fallen oak leaves fills the crisp Missouri air. Beside him, Shadow waits patiently, his amber eyes already fixed on the distant hill where the enormous oak tree stands alone against the brightening sky. Daniel notices the familiar stare and smiles quietly. You already have a favorite place, do you not? He asks with gentle amusement. The German shepherd turns toward him only briefly before trotting across the pasture with calm determination. Daniel allows him the freedom. Shadow has always earned his trust. During their years together, the shepherd has never wandered far without reason. Daniel spends the next hour unpacking boxes inside the farmhouse, hanging a framed photograph of his late parents near the fireplace, stacking books on old wooden shelves, and arranging simple kitchen supplies inside worn cabinets that still carry the scent of fresh pine. The house is humble, but it feels peaceful in a way his previous apartment in the city never could. Every window opens toward trees, open sky, and quiet land untouched by constant traffic or crowded streets. From time to time, Daniel glances toward the pasture through the kitchen window. Each time he finds Shadow in exactly the same place beneath the sprawling oak tree. Sometimes the shepherd sits silently. Sometimes he lowers his nose to the ground. Sometimes he digs gently for only a minute or two before stopping and simply watching the earth beneath him. Nothing about the behavior appears frantic. It resembles patience more than curiosity. Near noon, Daniel walks across the field carrying a small shovel, thinking perhaps an old animal burrow or buried tree root has caught Shadow's attention. The cool breeze carries the scent of dried leaves while squirrels chase one another through the high branches overhead. As Daniel approaches, Shadow steps aside without resistance and quietly watches. Daniel gently digs where the shepherd had been working. Only loose soil, tangled roots, smooth river, stones, and decades of rich black earth greet him. There is nothing unusual beneath the surface. No pipe, no old fence, no buried object. He laughs softly and taps the shovel against his boot. You fooled both of us this time. Shadow slowly walks back to the shallow hole, lowers his nose toward the freshly turned earth, then gently places one paw beside it before looking directly into Daniel's eyes. The expression is impossible to explain. It carries no excitement and no disappointment, only quiet certainty, as though the shepherd knows something that simply cannot be rushed. Daniel fills the small hole once again and rests one hand affectionately against Shadow's broad neck. Together they return toward the farmhouse where the afternoon passes peacefully. As evening settles across Ash Hollow, Daniel drives into town for groceries. The local general store is small, welcoming, and filled with familiar conversations among neighbors who have known one another for decades. Several people notice the newcomer immediately. They greet him warmly, asking about the old farmhouse he recently purchased. An elderly cashier smiles when Daniel mentions the large oak tree standing behind the property. Her expression lingers for just a heartbeat before she quietly says, "That old tree has watched over this town longer than anyone still living." Before Daniel can ask what she means, another customer calls her name from the opposite end of the store. She smiles politely, finishes the receipt, and says nothing more. Driving home beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, Daniel cannot stop thinking about her words. When he reaches the farmhouse, Shadow is already sitting beneath the old oak once again, perfectly still in the silver glow of the rising moon, patiently guarding a place that no one else seems to understand. Over the following weeks, a quiet rhythm settles over Daniel Carter's new life in Ash Hollow. Every morning begins with the scent of fresh coffee drifting across the farmhouse porch, the sound of distant songbirds greeting the sunrise, and the familiar sight of Shadow waiting patiently at the bottom of the wooden steps. Without needing a command, the German shepherd starts walking toward the old oak tree as though following an invisible trail that has existed far longer than either of them. Daniel eventually stops questioning the routine. Instead, he simply walks beside his loyal companion through the dew-covered pasture, listening to the gentle rustle of dry grass beneath their boots and paws. Each visit unfolds almost exactly the same way. Shadow circles the enormous trunk once, lowers his nose to the earth, then begins digging slowly in the very same spot. His movements are never hurried. Every careful stroke of his powerful front paws seems deliberate, almost respectful. After only a minute or two, he stops, sits beside the shallow hole, and quietly watches the ground as if patiently waiting for something that refuses to reveal itself. Daniel kneels beside him each time, brushing away loose soil with his hands. He finds nothing except thick oak roots, smooth stones, rich dark earth, and the unmistakable scent of damp leaves that have rested beneath the tree for countless autumns. By the end of the first month, several neighbors have begun noticing the unusual routine. Farmers driving tractors across nearby fields slowed down to watch the veteran and his German shepherd making the same morning walk. Children riding bicycles along the country road sometimes stop beside the fence, whispering curiously while Shadow continues his quiet work without paying attention to anyone around him. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel is repairing the old split-rail fence near the pasture when an elderly neighbor named Walter Briggs strolls over carrying a weathered straw hat beneath one arm. Walter has lived in Ash Hollow his entire life, and his kind face reflects decades spent beneath the Missouri sun. He watches Shadow digging beneath the oak tree before speaking. "That dog has quite a habit," Walter says with a gentle smile. Daniel nods. Every single day, Walter studies the shepherd for another moment. Most dogs eventually lose interest in one place. Daniel leans against the fence post and quietly replies, "Shadow never keeps doing something unless he believes it matters." Walter says nothing for several long seconds. His eyes drift toward the towering oak whose branches sway softly against the bright autumn sky. Finally, he speaks almost to himself. "That old tree has seen more stories than the rest of us put together." Daniel turns toward him with quiet curiosity, remembering the cashier's mysterious words at the general store. "Do you know anything about it?" Walter smiles politely, but slowly shakes his head. "Only old stories. Folks around here stopped talking about them years ago." Before Daniel can ask another question, Walter tips his hat, wishes him a good afternoon, and walks back toward his neighboring farm, leaving behind more questions than answers. The days continue passing peacefully. Morning follows morning. Week follows week. Shadow never misses a visit to the oak tree. Even when cold November rain soaks the pasture or sharp winds scatter thousands of golden leaves across the hillside, the faithful German shepherd returns to the exact same place with unwavering determination. Daniel no longer tries to stop him. Instead, he quietly sits beneath the massive branches, reading a book while Shadow patiently digs beside the ancient roots. One chilly evening, just before sunset paints the western sky with shades of crimson and gold, Daniel notices something different. After finishing his usual shallow digging, Shadow suddenly steps backward, tilts his head slightly, and stares toward a small section of bark near the base of the enormous trunk. Daniel follows his gaze. Carved deep into the weathered wood, almost completely hidden beneath decades of moss and age, are two faded initials enclosed within the outline of a carefully carved heart. Daniel stepped closer to the enormous oak, brushing away the thick layer of moss with slow, careful movements until the faded carving became easier to see. Two weathered initials rested inside a small heart that had nearly disappeared beneath decades of growing bark. Time had softened every edge, yet someone had once stood beneath this very tree believing the mark would last forever. Shadow remained perfectly still beside the trunk, his amber eyes fixed not on the carving but on the patch of earth where he had spent countless mornings digging. The evening breeze carried the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke, while the setting sun painted the sprawling branches with warm shades of amber and bronze. Daniel rested one hand against the rough bark, feeling its deep ridges beneath his fingertips. "You have been standing here a long time," he whispered quietly. The old tree answered only with the gentle rustle of thousands of leaves overhead. That night, the mysterious carving remained in Daniel's thoughts long after darkness settled across Ash Hollow. The following morning, after their usual visit beneath the oak, Daniel drove into town and stopped at the small public library occupying one corner of the historic courthouse square. The building smelled pleasantly of polished wood, aging paper, and fresh coffee drifting from a reading room near the entrance. Behind the front desk sat Margaret Ellis, the town librarian, whose warm smile welcomed nearly everyone by name. Daniel introduced himself and asked if the library kept historical maps or records about older farms surrounding Ash Hollow. Margaret nodded with quiet enthusiasm and guided him toward a room filled with local archives, yellowed newspapers, and carefully preserved county records stretching back more than 100 years. For nearly 2 hours, Daniel studied faded property maps, handwritten census books, and black and white photographs of families who once lived throughout the surrounding countryside. Most documents revealed nothing unusual. Farms had changed owners. Roads had shifted. Barns had disappeared. Yet one aging survey map from the early 1950s caught his attention. The pasture behind his farmhouse was clearly marked, and beside the large oak appeared a handwritten note simply reading Memorial Tree. Daniel frowned. There was no explanation beside the words, no symbol, and no additional reference anywhere else on the page. Curious, he carried the map back to Margaret. She adjusted her reading glasses and studied the faded note carefully. That is unusual, she admitted softly. I have never noticed this before. Daniel asked whether anyone still living might remember why the tree had once been called a memorial. Margaret thought quietly for several moments before answering. If anyone would know, it would probably be Reverend Thomas Bennett. He has lived here longer than almost anyone else. That afternoon, Daniel visited the small white church standing near the edge of town. Reverend Bennett welcomed him warmly, offering fresh coffee inside the peaceful office overlooking the cemetery. When Daniel unfolded the old survey map and pointed toward the handwritten note, the elderly minister remained silent much longer than expected. He removed his glasses and looked through the window where golden leaves drifted slowly across the churchyard. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. When I was a little boy, the older folks sometimes mentioned that tree. They always lowered their voices whenever its name came up. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Did they ever say why? The Reverend slowly shook his head. No. They only said some promises should never be forgotten, even after the people who made them are gone. Before Daniel could ask another question, the church bell rang softly outside, announcing the beginning of an evening choir rehearsal. Reverend Bennett smiled apologetically and walked him to the front door. As Daniel drove home beneath the fading light, the words echoed quietly through his thoughts. Some promises should never be forgotten. When he reached the farmhouse, Shadow was already waiting near the pasture gate. Without hesitation, the faithful German shepherd turned and began walking toward the old oak once again, as though every answer Daniel sought had been patiently waiting beneath its ancient roots all along. Winter arrives quietly across Ash Hollow, covering the rolling pasture with a thin blanket of frost that sparkles beneath each pale sunrise. The towering oak stands bare against the gray morning sky, its ancient branches stretching over the silent hillside like patient arms that have watched generations come and go. Every morning begins exactly as it always has. Daniel Carter pours fresh coffee into the same enamel mug, pulls on his weathered boots, and walks beside Shadow through the crisp Missouri air toward the old tree. The German shepherd never hesitates. Snow, rain, frozen ground, or bitter wind make no difference. He always stops at the exact same place beside the massive roots, lowers his nose toward the earth, and gently begins digging with calm determination. Daniel has long since stopped trying to interrupt him. Instead, he quietly brushes away loose snow from a fallen log beneath the spreading branches and watches his faithful companion continue a routine that has become as familiar as sunrise itself. Months slowly become seasons. Spring returns with fields of wildflowers dancing beneath warm breezes. Summer follows, filling the countryside with the scent of fresh grass, buzzing bees, and long golden evenings where fireflies shimmer above the pasture after sunset. Through every changing season, Shadow returns to the oak without missing a single day. The shallow hole beneath the roots grows only slightly deeper because Daniel always fills it before they leave, unwilling to damage the ancient tree that has somehow become part of both their lives. The routine begins attracting quiet attention throughout the town. Children riding bicycles often wave toward the hillside, smiling whenever they see the veteran sitting peacefully beneath the oak while the German shepherd patiently works beside him. Farmers passing with tractors raise friendly hands in greeting. Even visitors driving along the country road occasionally slow their vehicles, curious about the unusual sight of a dog returning to the exact same place day after day without fail. One warm July afternoon, Daniel receives an unexpected visit from Emily Foster, the president of the Ash Hollow Historical Society. She introduces herself with an easy smile and explains that several residents have mentioned Shadow's unusual behavior. Rather than laughing at the story, Emily appears genuinely interested. Together they walk toward the oak where Shadow quietly continues his familiar routine beneath the broad shade of the enormous branches. Emily kneels beside the shallow hole, gently lifting a handful of rich black soil before allowing it to fall slowly through her fingers. There are many stories connected to this land, she says thoughtfully. Most have disappeared because no one remained to tell them. Daniel points toward the faded initials carved into the trunk. Emily studies them carefully before taking several photographs with a small camera. She recognizes neither set of initials, yet something about the weathered carving clearly captures her attention. Before leaving, she promises to search older church records, family letters, and county archives that have never been fully cataloged. Daniel thanks her, though he quietly wonders whether any written record could possibly explain what Shadow seems to understand without words. Another year quietly slips away. Autumn returns once more, painting the hillside in brilliant shades of crimson, copper, and gold. Shadow is older now. Tiny strands of silver have begun appearing around his muzzle, yet his determination remains completely unchanged. One cool evening, after finishing his usual gentle digging, the German Shepherd does something he has never done before. Instead of sitting beside the shallow hole, he carefully places one front paw upon the earth, lowers his head, and remains perfectly still. Daniel kneels beside him, placing a reassuring hand against the shepherd's broad shoulder. Beneath the fading light, the disturbed soil catches a brief glimmer that almost escapes his notice. He brushes away a thin layer of loose dirt with careful fingers. For only a single second, something small beneath the earth reflects the last golden rays of the setting sun before disappearing once again beneath the quiet shadow of the ancient oak. Daniel brushed away another thin layer of loose earth with the tips of his fingers, careful not to disturb the thick network of ancient oak roots woven beneath the soil. The fading sunlight caught the tiny reflection once again, this time lingering long enough for him to see that it was not an ordinary stone. Something metallic rested just below the surface, hidden beneath decades of rich black earth and fallen leaves. Shadow remained perfectly still beside him, one broad paw resting gently against the edge of the shallow hole, as though patiently waiting for Daniel to notice what had always been there. The veteran reached for the small folding trowel he often carried while working around the farmhouse. Instead of digging deeply, he loosened the soil inch by inch with quiet patience. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of dry leaves, cedar, and distant wood smoke drifting across the valley while the last rays of sunlight filtered through the sprawling branches overhead. After several careful minutes, Daniel uncovered the edge of a small brass object no larger than the palm of his hand. He lifted it slowly from the earth and gently wiped away the remaining dirt with his sleeve. It was an old brass button, beautifully crafted despite the passing years, engraved with the unmistakable image of an American eagle surrounded by delicate lettering worn smooth by time. Daniel turned it over beneath the fading light. A rusted fastening loop remained attached to the back, confirming it had once belonged to a uniform rather than ordinary clothing. Shadow leaned forward, quietly sniffed the button, then calmly looked back toward the same patch of ground instead of celebrating the discovery. Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "You are telling me this is only the beginning, are you not?" The German Shepherd answered only by lowering his head toward the earth once again. Daniel slipped the button carefully into his jacket pocket and covered the shallow hole before they returned to the farmhouse. That evening he placed the brass button upon the kitchen table beneath a warm reading lamp and carefully searched through several military reference books left from his years of service. None provided a perfect match, yet every detail suggested the button had belonged to an American uniform manufactured many decades earlier. The following morning Daniel drove into Ash Hollow carrying the button inside a small cloth pouch. Emily Foster greeted him warmly at the Historical Society office, where shelves overflowed with county records, family photographs, handwritten journals, and carefully labeled artifacts donated by generations of local families. She adjusted her glasses as Daniel placed the weathered button into her hand. For several quiet moments, she examined it beneath a magnifying lamp without speaking. Finally, she looked up with visible surprise. "This is much older than I expected," she said softly. "I cannot identify the exact uniform yet, but I believe it predates the Second World War." Daniel explained where Shadow had found it. Emily remained silent for a long moment before walking toward a locked cabinet containing fragile archival maps. She carefully unfolded one large survey drawn nearly 90 years earlier. The enormous oak appeared exactly where it stood today. Beside it, someone had written a small notation, almost too faded to read. Emily traced the words gently with one finger before whispering them aloud. Gathering place. Daniel looked from the map toward the brass button resting on the table. Neither clue explained why Shadow returned every day, yet together they suggested that the old oak had once meant far more to Ash Hollow than anyone still remembered. Before leaving, Emily promised to continue searching church records, family diaries, and forgotten newspaper collections for any reference connecting the gathering place with the mysterious memorial tree. As Daniel stepped outside into the bright autumn afternoon, he found Shadow waiting quietly beneath the shade of a maple tree across the street. The German shepherd rose calmly, walked beside him without hesitation, and together they began the familiar drive home, carrying one small brass button that seemed far too ordinary to change the history of an entire town, yet somehow felt destined to do exactly that. The years continued to unfold with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and before Daniel fully realized it, for autumns had passed since the morning Shadow first walked beneath the ancient oak. The white American veteran no longer measured time by calendars hanging inside the farmhouse. He measured it by the familiar rhythm of faithful footsteps crossing the pasture at sunrise, by the first crimson leaves drifting from the towering branches each October, and by the silver hairs that had gradually spread across Shadow's once youthful muzzle. The German shepherd moved a little more slowly now, but never with hesitation. Every morning he still walked directly toward the same place beneath the old tree, lowered his nose to the earth, and gently scratched away only a few inches of soil before sitting quietly beside the shallow hollow. Daniel had stopped filling the little hole months earlier. Somehow it no longer felt right to erase the place Shadow had chosen with such unwavering devotion. The small circle of dark earth became part of the landscape, as natural as the roots surrounding it. Word of the remarkable routine spread far beyond Ash Hollow. Families visiting relatives often stopped along the country road to watch from a respectful distance. Local newspaper reporters occasionally asked Daniel for interviews, but he always smiled politely and declined. "There is no story yet," he would say. "There is only a dog doing something he believes is important." Emily Foster continued searching through forgotten archives every spare evening. Old church ledgers, faded family letters, abandoned property records, and dusty courthouse files slowly revealed fragments of forgotten lives, yet no document explained why the old oak had once been called both the memorial tree and the gathering place. The brass button remained displayed inside a protective case at the Historical Society, while researchers quietly searched military collections across Missouri, hoping to identify its exact origin. No definite answer ever arrived. Reverend Thomas Bennett often joined Daniel beneath the oak during warm spring afternoons. The elderly minister rarely spoke. Sometimes the two men simply watched Shadow resting beside the shallow hollow while birds nested among the sprawling branches overhead. One peaceful afternoon, the Reverend quietly said, "Some prayers are spoken without words." Daniel looked toward Shadow, who lay peacefully with one paw resting near the same patch of earth. "Maybe this is one of them," he answered softly. Winter came and went once more. Spring rains nourished the pasture until wildflowers surrounded the great oak in a circle of white, yellow, and violet blossoms. Summer followed with long golden evenings filled with crickets and fireflies dancing beneath the enormous branches. Through every season, Shadow remained faithful to the place no one else understood. Then one September afternoon, powerful storms rolled across the Missouri countryside unlike any the town had experienced in years. Thunder echoed beyond the hills while fierce winds swept through Ash Hollow, bending trees and scattering thousands of leaves across open fields. Daniel secured the farmhouse windows before searching for Shadow, only to find the faithful German shepherd already standing beneath the old oak despite the driving rain. He hurried across the soaked pasture and called gently for his companion. Shadow did not move. Instead, he stood facing the massive trunk with calm determination as the powerful wind roared through the ancient branches overhead. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed across the hillside. One enormous limb, weakened by countless decades, slowly broke free and crashed harmlessly to the ground several yards away. As the earth trembled beneath its weight, Part of the thick root system lifted slightly from the saturated soil. Daniel stared in stunned silence. Beneath the exposed roots, where shadow had patiently returned every single day for 4 long years, the storm revealed the corner of a weathered wooden box resting inside a carefully built stone-lined compartment that no passing season had managed to uncover until that very moment. The storm finally passed during the early hours of the morning, leaving Ash Hollow wrapped in an extraordinary silence broken only by dripping branches and distant birds cautiously returning to the countryside. Heavy clouds drifted slowly eastward while pale sunlight filtered across the soaked pasture, turning every drop of rain upon the old oak into tiny flashes of gold. Daniel Carter stood beneath the enormous tree with Shadow quietly beside him, both staring at the section of exposed roots where the weathered wooden box remained partially visible inside its carefully constructed stone chamber. The German shepherd did not attempt to dig. His work, after 4 patient years, seemed complete. He simply sat beside the opening with calm eyes and relaxed ears, watching Daniel with the same quiet certainty he had carried since the very first morning they arrived at the farmhouse. Daniel knelt carefully beside the exposed compartment, taking great care not to disturb the ancient roots that surrounded it. The wooden box measured roughly 18 inches long and perhaps a foot wide. Time had darkened the oak boards almost black, yet the corners remained tightly joined by hand-forged brass fittings protected beneath layers of clay and stone. It did not resemble a treasure chest. It looked more like something built to preserve memories rather than valuables. Daniel resisted the temptation to pull it free alone. Instead, he covered the exposed compartment with a clean canvas tarp to shield it from further moisture before telephoning Emily Foster at the Ash Hollow Historical Society. Less than an hour later, Emily arrived with Reverend Thomas Bennett and the county preservation officer, Samuel Pierce. None of them spoke loudly as they approached the ancient tree. Somehow the hillside itself invited quiet voices. Together, they carefully removed the remaining loose soil around the compartment using only wooden tools and soft brushes. After nearly an hour of patient work, the box lifted smoothly from its resting place, as though someone long ago had carefully prepared it to be found exactly this way. Emily placed the weathered box upon a folding table beneath the broad branches of the oak. Everyone stood silently while she gently cleaned away the remaining dirt from its brass latch. The lock had long since rusted open. With steady hands, she slowly raised the heavy lid. Inside rested several oilcloth bundles arranged with remarkable care. Despite the passing decades, everything remained astonishingly well preserved. On top lay a neatly folded American flag no larger than a hand towel. Beneath it rested a leather-bound journal wrapped inside waxed cloth, several carefully tied letters, a bundle of faded photographs, 2 military dog tags attached by a tarnished chain, and a small wooden case containing a silver pocket watch whose hands had stopped at exactly 3:17. Daniel noticed that Shadow quietly stepped closer to the table but never touched any of the objects. His gaze rested only upon the journal. Emily gently unfolded the protective cloth and opened the weathered leather cover. The first page carried elegant handwriting that remained perfectly readable despite the years. The room beneath the tree fell completely silent as she read the opening line aloud. To the people of Ash Hollow, if this journal is ever found, it means the promise we made beneath this tree has finally been kept. Reverend Bennett slowly removed his glasses while emotion softened his expression. Samuel Pierce quietly photographed every page before anyone turned another. Daniel stood with one hand resting gently against Shadow's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the faithful companion who had somehow refused to abandon this place for 4 remarkable years. Emily carefully turned to the next page. Beneath the handwritten introduction rested a beautifully preserved photograph showing dozens of smiling townspeople gathered beneath the very same oak tree nearly 80 years earlier. Standing near the center of the crowd was a young man, wearing the same style of brass uniform button Daniel had discovered years before, his hand resting proudly upon the head of a sable-coated German shepherd whose intelligent amber eyes looked astonishingly familiar. Emily carefully lifted the faded photograph from the weathered box, holding it beneath the soft morning light filtering through the ancient oak branches. Every face remained surprisingly clear despite the passing decades. Families stood shoulder to shoulder in their Sunday clothes. Children smiled proudly beside handmade picnic tables, and veterans wearing neatly pressed uniforms gathered beneath the same enormous tree that still watched over Ash Hollow. Near the center stood the young man Daniel had noticed immediately. One hand rested gently upon the head of a noble sable-coated German shepherd while the other held a folded American flag against his chest. The resemblance between that faithful dog and Shadow was so striking that everyone standing around the table quietly exchanged surprised glances. Emily turned the photograph over with great care. Written neatly across the back appeared a date from the spring of 1946, followed by a simple caption. The day we came home together. Reverend Thomas Bennett slowly smiled as though an old memory had finally awakened. My grandfather once mentioned a celebration after the war, he whispered. He said nearly the whole town gathered beneath the old oak, but nobody ever kept the photographs. Emily carefully unfolded the leather journal and began reading aloud while the cool autumn breeze stirred the fallen leaves around their feet. The journal belonged to Sergeant William Harper, a young soldier who returned home after military service with his loyal German shepherd, Duke. Rather than writing about medals or personal achievements, William filled every page with gratitude toward the people who had supported one another through years of hardship. He described neighbors harvesting crops together when families struggled, teachers opening classrooms for evening community meals, church volunteers caring for children, and Duke quietly comforting frightened youngsters simply by remaining beside them. The Great Oak, according to William, became the place where the entire town gathered each season to celebrate friendship, remember loved ones, and welcome every soldier safely home. Daniel listened without speaking while Shadow rested quietly beside his boots, his amber eyes never leaving the open journal. Emily continued reading until one passage caused her voice to soften. William explained that before his death he wished every letter, photograph, and memory collected inside the wooden box to remain hidden beneath the old oak until someone guided by unwavering loyalty found them. He believed future generations might someday forget how deeply neighbors once depended upon one another, and he hoped the stories would return only when the town truly needed to remember. Samuel Pierce carefully untied the bundle of preserved letters. Each envelope carried the name of a local family whose descendants still lived throughout Ash Hollow. None contained money, legal documents, or hidden wealth. Instead, every letter expressed heartfelt thanks for simple acts of generosity that had quietly changed lives without ever appearing in newspapers or official records. One letter thanked a widow for sharing homemade bread with struggling families every winter. Another honored a local carpenter who repaired homes without accepting payment. Another praised a schoolteacher who spent evenings teaching returning veterans new skills so they could rebuild peaceful lives. Daniel slowly realized why Shadow had refused to abandon the tree. The faithful German shepherd had never been searching for treasure. He had patiently guarded a legacy of kindness waiting to be remembered. Emily gently closed the journal, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. This changes the history of our town, she whispered. Reverend Bennett slowly nodded. No, he answered softly. It reminds us what our history always was. As the autumn breeze carried another shower of golden leaves across the hillside, Shadow quietly walked to the base of the ancient oak and lay peacefully beside the shallow hollow where he had spent 4 remarkable years waiting. For the first time since Daniel had known him, the faithful German shepherd closed his eyes beneath the great tree without feeling the need to dig again. News of the discovery spread through Ash Hollow with remarkable speed, yet the town responded not with excitement, but with quiet reflection. By the following weekend, neighbors gathered beneath the ancient oak carrying folding chairs, homemade pies, old family photographs, and weathered boxes that had remained untouched in attics for generations. The hillside where Shadow had spent 4 faithful years digging slowly transformed into something far more meaningful than a place of curiosity. It became a place of remembrance. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the great tree, with one hand resting gently upon Shadow's broad shoulders, while Emily Foster carefully displayed copies of Sergeant William Harper's journal beneath a protective glass case borrowed from the Historical Society. Families waited patiently to read each handwritten page. Many smiled softly as they recognized familiar surnames written throughout the letters. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes after discovering stories of grandparents and great-grandparents whose kindness had never appeared in any history book. The forgotten acts described inside the wooden box began connecting generations in ways no one had expected. Reverend Thomas Bennett opened the gathering with a simple prayer of gratitude rather than ceremony. His voice carried gently beneath the spreading branches as sunlight filtered through thousands of golden leaves overhead. He thanked those whose names had survived inside the journals and those whose names had quietly disappeared while their kindness continued shaping lives long after they were gone. When the prayer ended, no one applauded. The silence itself became an expression of respect. Throughout the afternoon, remarkable conversations unfolded beneath the old oak. One elderly woman recognized her grandmother's name inside a handwritten letter thanking her for sewing winter coats for children during difficult years. A retired carpenter discovered that his own grandfather had repaired the farmhouse belonging to Sergeant William Harper without accepting payment after the war. A schoolteacher quietly smiled after reading about an educator who had opened evening classes for returning veterans many decades earlier. Piece by piece, Ash Hollow rediscovered the invisible threads of generosity that had quietly held the community together through generations. Emily organized volunteers to preserve every journal, photograph, and letter using archival materials so the originals would remain protected for future generations. The Historical Society announced plans to create a permanent exhibit celebrating not only Sergeant William Harper and Duke, but every ordinary family whose compassion had helped shape the town's history. Daniel listened to the conversations while Shadow rested peacefully beneath the oak, greeting children who approached with gentle curiosity. Many knelt beside the aging German shepherd, softly running their fingers through his sable coat, while parents quietly explained that he had never stopped believing something important remained beneath the tree. Shadow accepted every gentle touch with calm dignity before resting his head once again upon the earth he had faithfully guarded for so long. Later that afternoon, Samuel Pierce made an unexpected announcement. After carefully comparing military records, family archives, and the recovered journal, historians had confirmed that the brass button Daniel discovered belonged to Sergeant William Harper's original service uniform. It had likely separated from his coat during the community gathering described inside the photograph shortly after the war ended. The tiny object, overlooked beneath the soil for generations, had quietly marked the exact place where the wooden memorial box had been hidden beneath the oak. Daniel reached into his pocket and held the polished button between his fingers, smiling softly as warm sunlight reflected across its weathered surface. It no longer seemed like an ordinary piece of metal. It had become the first whisper in a story that Shadow somehow heard years before anyone else. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, families remained gathered beneath the ancient branches sharing food, memories, laughter, and gratitude exactly as Sergeant William Harper had described nearly 80 years earlier. Watching the children play beneath the old oak while neighbors spoke kindly with one another, Daniel quietly realized that Shadow had not only uncovered a forgotten history. The faithful German shepherd had patiently led an entire town back to itself. As autumn slowly gave way to another quiet winter, life in Ash Hollow settled into a gentler rhythm shaped by the remarkable discovery beneath the ancient oak. The Historical Society carefully preserved every journal, photograph, letter, and keepsake recovered from the weathered wooden box, while townspeople found themselves visiting the small museum more often than they ever had before. School children walked through the exhibits with curious eyes, stopping before the faded photograph of Sergeant William Harper standing proudly beside Duke beneath the same oak tree that still overlooked the valley. Teachers encouraged students to read the handwritten letters, not because they contained extraordinary adventures, but because they revealed how ordinary kindness had quietly transformed an entire community. Daniel Carter volunteered several mornings each week, helping visitors understand the story without ever making himself the center of it. Whenever someone thanked him for uncovering the forgotten history, he simply smiled and glanced toward Shadow resting peacefully nearby. "He found it," Daniel always replied. "I only chose to follow him." The faithful German shepherd had become something of a local legend, though nothing about his daily routine changed. Each sunrise, he still walked with Daniel across the familiar pasture to the old oak. The difference was beautifully simple. He no longer dug. Instead, he quietly circled the great trunk once before lying comfortably beneath its wide branches, as though satisfied that his long watch had finally ended. The shallow hollow beneath the roots gradually filled with fallen leaves, soft grass, and fresh wildflowers planted by children from the local elementary school. No one disturbed the place anymore. It had become a symbol of patient faith rather than unanswered mystery. One crisp December afternoon, Emily Foster invited Daniel to the museum archives where several newly restored documents had just arrived from a regional conservation laboratory. Among them rested a carefully cleaned photograph that had once been nearly impossible to recognize. This version revealed additional faces standing beneath the oak on the day the town gathered after the war. Emily quietly pointed toward a young boy, standing near Sergeant William Harper and Duke. "We identified him yesterday," she said softly. "He grew up to become Walter Briggs." Daniel smiled with quiet surprise. The elderly farmer who had first told him the tree had witnessed more stories than anyone still living had unknowingly stood inside one of those stories as a child. Later that evening, Daniel visited Walter's farmhouse, carrying a restored copy of the photograph. The old farmer studied it for several long minutes before gently laughing through misted eyes. "I remember the picnic," he whispered. "I remember Duke walking from family to family while everyone shared supper beneath the tree. I had forgotten until now." Daniel placed the photograph into Walter's hands. "Now you can remember again." Walter nodded slowly. "That dog remembered for all of us." As Christmas approached, the town council quietly voted to restore the old community gathering beneath the oak every autumn, honoring not only Sergeant William Harper and Duke, but every generation that had carried kindness forward without expecting recognition. There would be no grand monument and no elaborate ceremony. Families would simply gather beneath the branches, share food, tell stories, welcome neighbors, and leave with grateful hearts exactly as their grandparents once had. On the first evening after the announcement, Daniel and Shadow stood together beneath the ancient tree while soft snowflakes drifted silently across the quiet pasture. The old oak rose peacefully into the winter sky, its bare branches reaching outward with timeless grace. Shadow rested comfortably against Daniel's boots, closing his amber eyes for a few peaceful moments. Daniel looked upward through the gently falling snow and smiled. Some legacies survived because people protected them. Others survived because one faithful heart refused to walk away until the right people finally remembered. Another year passed with quiet grace, and the familiar path leading from the farmhouse to the old oak became even more precious to Daniel Carter. Every season left its own gentle signature upon the hillside. Spring covered the pasture with wildflowers. Summer filled the air with the scent of warm grass and singing crickets. Autumn wrapped the ancient branches in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Winter settled softly across the valley with sparkling frost that turned each sunrise into something almost sacred. Through every season, Daniel and Shadow continued their morning walks, although the pace grew slower with time. The faithful German shepherd had entered the later years of his life. His once powerful stride had become measured and careful, and the silver around his muzzle now blended with the soft morning light. Yet his amber eyes remained bright with the same quiet wisdom that had first led Daniel across the pasture years before. Daniel never hurried him. Sometimes they paused halfway to the oak so Shadow could simply stand and breathe the fresh country air while gentle. Breezes carried the scent of cedar, damp earth, and fallen leaves across the hillside. The town noticed the change as well. Children who had once run excitedly to greet Shadow now approached more gently, kneeling beside him with patient smiles and offering quiet affection instead of playful excitement. Neighbors often waved from passing trucks, not wanting to disturb the peaceful routine that had become part of Ash Hollow itself. One crisp October morning, Daniel packed a small wool blanket, a thermos of coffee, and 2 homemade biscuits before walking beside Shadow toward the old oak. The sky was perfectly clear, and golden sunlight filtered through thousands of autumn leaves drifting slowly onto the familiar ground beneath the sprawling branches. They reached the tree just as they had on countless mornings before. Shadow quietly circled the massive trunk one final time, stopping beside the place where the wooden memorial box had rested for so many years. He lowered himself onto the blanket with a contented sigh and rested his head upon his front paws. Daniel sat beside him, leaning comfortably against the rough bark of the ancient oak. Neither of them needed words. The silence between them had always carried more meaning than conversation ever could. Daniel removed the polished brass button from his jacket pocket, turning it gently between his fingers while sunlight reflected across its weathered surface. He smiled softly as memories returned one after another. The first strange morning beneath the tree, the mysterious carving hidden beneath moss, the forgotten journal, the letters filled with gratitude, the smiling faces in the old photograph, the town gathering once again beneath these very branches after nearly 8 decades. None of it would have happened without the faithful companion now resting peacefully beside him. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, filling the air with their quiet whisper. Shadow slowly lifted his head and looked toward Daniel. Their eyes met for a long moment filled with complete understanding. Daniel reached forward and gently stroked the shepherd's neck, smiling through quiet emotion. "You kept your promise," he whispered, "even when none of us knew there was one to keep." Shadow leaned comfortably against Daniel's leg before turning his gaze toward the open pasture stretching beyond the hill. Families could be seen in the distance preparing tables for the annual community gathering that had once again become part of the town's tradition. Children's laughter floated softly across the valley. Church bells rang gently from the center of Ash Hollow. The old oak stood watch over everything exactly as it always had. As the afternoon sunlight slowly settled across the hillside, Daniel realized something beautiful. Shadow no longer came to the tree searching for hidden answers. He came because the place no longer carried unfinished memories. It carried peace. And beneath the ancient branches where forgotten kindness had finally been remembered, both the faithful German shepherd and the grateful veteran quietly rested together, watching an entire community continue the promise that love, once rediscovered, should never be buried again. The following autumn arrived beneath a sky so clear that every golden leaf drifting from the ancient oak seemed to linger in the sunlight before gently touching the earth. Ash Hollow had changed in ways no one could have imagined only a few years earlier. Every October, families gathered beneath the great tree carrying picnic baskets, homemade bread, framed photographs, and stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. The tradition that Sergeant William Harper had hoped would never disappear had quietly found its way home again. Laughter filled the hillside. Children played beneath the broad branches while neighbors who once hurried past one another now lingered to share conversations that stretched well into the evening. At the center of it all stood a simple bronze plaque placed beside the old oak. It carried only a few humble words. In honor of every quiet act of kindness that shaped this town, and in gratitude to the faithful hearts that refused to let those memories disappear. Daniel Carter visited the plaque early each morning before anyone else arrived. It had become part of his daily walk with Shadow, whose steps had grown slower than ever, but whose spirit remained peaceful. The faithful German shepherd no longer searched the ground or watched the roots with quiet determination. Instead, he simply rested beneath the tree while Daniel sat beside him, listening to birds greet another sunrise across the Missouri hills. One calm morning, with soft mist rising from the pasture and the scent of fresh earth filling the cool air, Daniel noticed Shadow quietly watching the families beginning to gather in the distance for another community celebration. Children carried folding chairs. Parents spread blankets across the grass. Elderly neighbors smiled warmly as they greeted one another beneath the same branches that had sheltered generations before them. Shadow slowly leaned against Daniel's leg, breathing calmly while the first rays of sunlight touched his silver muzzle. Daniel gently placed one hand upon the shepherd's neck and smiled with quiet gratitude. "You never gave up on them," he whispered, "even when they had forgotten themselves." The breeze stirred gently through the leaves overhead, carrying their familiar whisper across the hillside. Daniel looked toward the restored farmhouse, the museum beyond the town square, the church whose bell echoed softly every Sunday morning, and the people who now gathered each year because one faithful German shepherd had patiently believed that something worth remembering still waited beneath the old oak. He finally understood that the greatest discovery had never been the journal, the letters, the photographs, or the brass button. Those were only reminders. The true treasure was the kindness those memories awakened inside living hearts. As the morning celebration began, Emily Foster welcomed several visiting historians, Reverend Thomas Bennett offered another simple prayer of gratitude. Walter Briggs smiled proudly beside the restored photograph of his childhood, and children listened with wide eyes as the story of William Harper and Duke was shared once again. Shadow quietly watched them all before resting comfortably beneath the spreading branches that had become his favorite place in the world. Daniel sat beside his lifelong companion without speaking, knowing some endings never truly felt like endings. They became beginnings carried forward by people willing to remember. The ancient oak continued standing above them, patient as ever, its roots holding the past while its branches reached toward tomorrow. Around it, laughter replaced silence, neighbors became friends again, and forgotten promises continued living through ordinary acts of compassion repeated day after day. As another golden leaf drifted gently onto the grass beside Shadow, Daniel smiled toward the endless countryside stretching beyond the hill. Some stories are written in journals. Some are carved into old trees. But the ones that change the world are often carried quietly inside a faithful heart until the day everyone else is finally ready to understand.